All right, I want to start with the last verse of chapter 9. So, because it's a transition into chapter 10. So Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 18 said that wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. So he's setting up our understanding. It can just take one person, one event to change the course of history. So now we move into Ecclesiastes chapter 10, and we'll do just the first 4 verses to begin. Dead flies make a perfumer's oil stink, so a little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. Even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool. If the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position, because composure allies great offenses. All right, back to verse 1. What is the picture that Solomon put forth first? Okay, dead flies in a perfumer's oil. So let's start with some questions. What is the purpose of perfume? And it's to give off a pleasant odor. The whole point is that it would be something that would be pleasant. So the scent, however, draws flies who then become trapped in the perfume. The result of the decaying bodies of the flies causes the entire perfume to become compromised, and the pleasant scent now stinks. It now is the opposite of what it was created to do. So this small invasion ruins the entire project. Do you see how that ties back with what he talked about at the end of chapter 9? One sinner, one little person or event can change things. This is compared to what at the end of that verse? He says, so what? A little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. So Solomon compares the flies in the perfume to a little foolishness. Does that make sense? That's the picture that he gives us. And now he's going to give us the implication for that. What does weightier mean? Heavier? How would I know it's heavier? I'd have a scale, right? I'd be measuring which thing was heavier to call something weightier. So what is being measured on the other side of the scale from the foolishness? Wisdom and honor. And he's saying that the foolishness is heavier on the scales. A little foolishness can have a bigger impact than a whole bunch of wisdom, right? He's given us that physical picture. So just a little foolishness in someone's life can have a bigger impact than all the wisdom and honor. Think about this. That had been previously accumulated. Think how many times, read the newspapers and watch men, women who've done all kinds of things, even in the Christian world, and then what happens, right? There's something that comes along, and it's their downfall. And what do you remember that person for? All the good things, or is the bad thing what comes to mind? So that's the picture that he's giving us here. In verse 2, what does Solomon describe next? He says, a wise man's heart directs him towards the right. If you look at the King James Version, it says a wise man's heart is at his right hand. So to understand that, I went to Psalms. So for those of you who want to learn to do the study, you might do a word study on when right hand is used in scriptures, and then go and look at those verses to see, can I get a flow of thought of how right hand is used in the scriptures? And there were a few, but because I am going to try to get through chapter 10, I won't read them all. So we're going to do Psalms chapter 16, verse 8, where it says, I have set the Lord continually before me because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. So the right hand would be a place of protection. This is compared with what in Ecclesiastes? The foolish man's heart directs him where? Towards the left. So opposite from what we learned about the right hand, now the left hand would not lead one to protection. A foolish man's heart leads him away from that safety. Verse 3, what else is true for the fool? Even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool. So what would it mean for someone to walk along the road in this day? What's up? It's danger, but I think the thing that he's trying to put forward is, because he's talking about it's in public, right? He's not walking along a private path in his garden where he can't be seen. The fool's willing to walk around and demonstrate his foolishness to others in a very public way, right? Basically, the fool is not self-aware of his foolishness. He's actually bragging about the very thing that he should understand is foolishness, but he doesn't have the discernment to do that. Does that make sense? Verse 4, what advice does Solomon now give? He says, if the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position. What is the situation that Solomon is describing? In other words, if the ruler's temper rises against you, so that's the situation he's putting you in and having you think through. So who would the ruler be to you? It would be your authority. Somebody who has authority over you, you would consider a ruler. What is described happening to the one in authority over you? The temper rises, he gets angry. So what response are you to have when one who's in authority is angry at you? Don't abandon your position, right? What is the position referring to? Whatever job, right? Whatever job that you're doing under that person's authority, don't stop doing the job that you've been hired to do. Could we do a whole lot of examples on that in our own lives and other lives that we know, right? This is simple words, hard to do. Solomon is not ignorant of the fact it's difficult. Do not walk away from the job that you are to do. In verse 4, how can staying on the job become beneficial? So, first he starts with composure. So what does composure mean? And I do this sometimes because, ladies, who knows who's listening? Who knows what experience people have in life? And we don't sometimes increase vocabulary in the younger population. And so sometimes it's a good idea to really define what a word is. So composure would be when something is serene, right? Self-controlled. It's a state of mind. It's calmness, it's tranquility. So when you stay serene in the face of an authority figure's anger, what can happen? Allies great offenses. What do we mean by ally? Allay the offenses. That it cancels it out, right? It's to put the fear and the doubt and the suspicion of the anger or whatever else to stay at rest and be quiet. So you can put to rest or calm or quiet the response of the one in authority who feels there has been a great offense committed against them. This is true whether there has been a great offense or not. Keep that in mind. It doesn't matter whether you were wrong or right, your response should be the same, to stay calm and to keep your composure. Staying in the good graces to those that are in authority is always beneficial. Always beneficial. So that took us right on through the first 4 verses. Didn't that make sense? All right, so now we're going to do verses 5 through 7. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, like an error which goes forth from the ruler. Folly is set in many exalted places, while rich men sit in humble places. I have seen slaves riding on horses and princes walking like slaves on the land. So in verse 5, what connection does Solomon now make? He says, there is an evil I have seen under the sun. So what key phrase alerts us to the fact that this was something that Solomon was a witness to? I have seen, right? We've learned that now, that we've done that several times in this book. Have we seen specific examples when we've stopped and we've pondered when he says I've seen, and we go to look, what could he be talking about? So what does it mean when Solomon has used the phrase under the sun? It's done on earth. So the evil is compared to what? He says, like an error which goes forth from the ruler. So in verse 6, in error, what did the ruler make? Folly is set in many exalted places. Right? Is that the error that Solomon is going to talk about here? So the ruler put men of folly in positions of leadership. What else occurred? And then the rich men sat in humbled places. Again, we want to make sure we follow what the word riches or rich men could be a reference to. And in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 24, we read, the crown of the wise is their riches. So the concept that wise men acquire riches is common in the scriptures. Men of folly would have been placed in positions of authority, while those who in fact were the rich or the wise men and should be considered leaders were not exalted in those leadership positions. You see how that's what is being described for us here? In verse 7 then, how had Solomon seen this demonstrated? All right, so so basically the roles of these men were reversed from what it should have been as we read that, correct? So here's some questions. Why the reference to slaves riding horses? Why would the princes be walking? When would Solomon have seen such an event? And that's where we get to go now. We're going to start in 1 Samuel. Chapter 8, and I'm only going to read the first verses there. The 10 and 11. So 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, this will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before the chariots. This scripture, or those two scriptures, are the beginning of a list of things that God told Samuel to warn the people that a king would do to them if they decided to go ahead and ask to have a king put over them. These things were not compliments, they were warnings about what a king would do. It would appear that the sons of David who attempted to make themselves king in his place misunderstood the words spoken by Samuel as a warning, and instead thought they were words describing the procedure of the king. Notice that was the words in Samuel where it said, this will be the procedure of the king. So we're going to look at those two events and see how both of the sons that tried to put themselves as the next king after David did exactly this. So if you look in 2 Samuel all the way now in verse 15, and we'll look at the first 6 verses. Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. I'm reading the rest just to give you the context of what else that Absalom did to put himself in the position to become the king. Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate, and when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." You see how he's undercutting the authority of the king of Israel. Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or cause would come to me, and I would give him justice." And when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. You see how he ingratiated himself to the men that came looking for answers? In this manner, Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Very deceptive. Now, in verse 1, the first thing that Absalom did to show himself in the position of the king was what? He provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. If you're just reading it, don't you just kind of move past that to the other things that Absalom did? This is what highlighted it for me. Adonijah did the same thing in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen with 50 men to run before him. Interesting little detail. Both of these men made the same mistake. They took what Solomon spoke that was to be descriptive, and they made it prescriptive. They believed it was part of what made them the king of Israel. Do you see how they did that? Samuel said this thing is going to occur. He's speaking of it in a negative way. They heard that or read that, or however these scriptures would have been communicated to them. Both of them do the same thing when they see themselves to be the next king. They get chariots and horsemen and men running before them, probably decrying, "Here comes the king." That was not what Samuel was communicating, and it was not what God was communicating. But they took it as, if I do this thing, I'll get the result that I want. That's not what Samuel had been talking about. Those that were riding the horses here would have been the slaves that were assigned that duty by Absalom and later by Adonijah. So this would explain the reference to the slaves riding horses. Where was Solomon during the insurrection of Absalom? And if I'd have a whole chart up here on the wall, and we do all the sons of David, and we talk about don't know all of those details. But we're going to read in 2 Samuel chapter 15, and we're going to read verses 14 through 16. David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, this is after the insurrection has begun, and it's known that Absalom has intentions to come and take down the leaders in Jerusalem. "Arise and let us flee, for otherwise none of us will escape from Absalom. Go in haste, or he will overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." Then the king's servant said to the king, "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king chooses." So the king went out, and all his household with him. But the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. So all of David's household left Jerusalem with David. This would include all the princes of Israel at the time, all his other sons. They all left in haste, and they walked out of Jerusalem and into the wilderness. Solomon would have been an eyewitness to this event. This would also explain why Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 6, that folly is sent in many exalted places, while the rich men sit in humble places. The rightful ruler or king and the princess and the leaders were in the wilderness or a humble place, while Absalom and his followers entered into Jerusalem. Does that tie that story in for you? A picture very clearly that Solomon would have seen himself and witnessed. Back to Ecclesiastes then, in chapter 10. We're going to do a little bit longer section here. We're going to read from verse 8 all the way through verse 15. He who digs a pit may fall into it, and a serpent may bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits logs may be endangered by them. If the axe is dull and he does not sharpen its edge, then he must exert more strength. Wisdom has the advantage of giving success. If the serpent bites before becoming charmed, there is no profit for the charmer. Words from the mouth of a wise man are gracious, while the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of his talking is folly, and the end of it is wicked madness. Yet the fool multiplies words. No man knows what will happen, and who can tell him what will come after him? The toil of a fool so wearies him that he does not even know how to go to a city. Doesn't that all make sense? All right, let's go back. We start with verse 8. What is the first observation that Solomon begins with? So he who digs a pit may fall into it. All right. Is it ever the goal of someone digging the pit to fall into it? No. So we know that's not the goal as the project begins. There is a risk that the man who dug the pit could fall into it, but it's not the planned outcome. What else does Solomon say can happen? A serpent may bite him who breaks through a wall. Again, understanding context and the times helps with this, because we don't often find people breaking through a wall, getting bit by serpents in our city, do we? Why would a man break through a wall in Solomon's time? Trying to conquer something. So in Solomon's time, walls were built to provide protection of property. Often those walls were built around entire cities. We've seen that over and over in the Old Testament. So when a man breaks through a wall, this would be his goal to enter the city, most likely to invade it, to conquer it. So the unexpected outcome for the man who has successfully broken through the wall is only to have a serpent bite him. And most likely that bite in that day would have been something that would have caused death. When a serpent bites, you would most likely die. So do you see the irony? They break through the wall, right? And once you break through the wall, now it's breached. And once the wall is breached, you're the winner. The invaders come in and they are the winners. So the very day that they think they're going to come in and be the invaders and succeed, they get bit by a serpent and they die instead. So the plan and the goal was moving along fine, and then something unexpected happened, like falling in a pit. The serpent bites and the person dies. Verse 9, what is described next? He who quarries stone may be hurt by them. So what does it mean when someone quarries stones? All right, they dig around the stone often, right? They take away the softer stone or the dirt that's holding the stone, right, to extract the stone that they want to use. And they usually then are going to take that stone and they're going to take it somewhere else for a building project. That's the goal when you quarry the stone. Get the stone out of where it is and take it to where I want to use it. How can someone be hurt in this process? right? Unexpectedly, the stone that you were going to take somewhere rolls out of its position or falls out of its position and lands on the person, right? And kills them or makes them lame, in which case they probably aren't going to do a whole lot more of coring of the stone. What else is depicted in that verse? We've got splitting logs. It may endanger them. So again, what does it mean to split logs? And I take this as different than felling logs, right? That would be taking a tree and chopping the tree down. He's very specific here. This is about the splitting of the log. So what is it when you split a log? What is your goal when you split wood? Right? Or I'll tell you what we used it for. That's right. We had a fire at our house. That's exactly right. So it's to take something larger, to break it down to something you can use. Some people use the wood to burn. Some people use it to build furniture, right? It has an ultimate purpose only when it's been made smaller. And how does one usually split logs? We use an axe. And what danger can happen when one splits logs? The axe can do something wrong and hit the person, or splinters from the log can come up and injure the person, right? There's all kinds of precautions you're supposed to take when you split the logs because it can be very dangerous. All of these have something in common. And that's what we're looking for. If Solomon's going to make a point, every one of these had something in common. What are some of the things you can see that were in common with all of these events described? There was
one intention that something else happened.
Absolutely. There were unintentional consequences of the work that the person can engage in. Each work was performed with the future goal in mind, right? To build a house, to break through a city. Everything had a future goal in mind. Each work described can be done successfully, but through an error, that mistake or accident can occur. The worker may not get to see the work completed. That's the common theme that I saw in those four. In verse 10, what does Solomon say about the tool that can be used? He says, if the axe is dull and he does not sharpen its edge, then he must exert more strength. This does not necessarily say it's about the splitting of the logs, but they could be connected. So when a tool is not used properly, it is more likely that the work is harder. That's his point here. He doesn't say that it causes the injury. He says he has to exert more strength. So he's moved to talking about the project becomes more difficult. What is that tool now compared to? He says wisdom has the advantage of giving success. Again, picture after picture after picture that Solomon is using. He says, just like a sharp axe is best to succeed at its specific job, so is wisdom a tool to be used to help a man's work end more successfully. What phrase do we often use in regards to work smarter, not harder? Smarter usually means more wisdom in what you're doing, right? You're more efficient. You've learned. You have more experience. So the more wisdom you have, you don't have to exert as much energy. In verse 11, what example does Solomon relate next? He says, if the serpent bites before being charmed, there is no profit for the charmer. Well, isn't that an understatement? Right? So when one is dealing with something or someone dangerous, like a serpent, there is always a chance that the danger will overtake them before the plan takes over to control the danger is completed. The result can be the benefit to the one expecting to control the situation, or the person is then thwarted. Because think about that. If you've seen the pictures, I don't know, many of you involved in snake charming? So most of you have the same experience I do. You've seen it on TV. You've seen it in a movie somewhere. And that's the picture that he wants you to come up with. So the person there is charming, and here comes the little serpent up. Why does everybody watch? What's the reason that you watch such an event? To see if he's able to control the snake or if he gets bit by it, right? That's the whole thing. And when he's successful, you're like, ooh, that was pretty dangerous. He did a dangerous thing. But it's because the risk of the bite was there. So do you see that situation? People participate in dangerous things thinking they're going to come along and they're going to manipulate or they're going to control it. And sometimes it bites them before they complete their devilish deed, right? Yeah, right, exactly. All right, verse 12. What two things does Solomon compare? He says, words from the mouth of a wise man are gracious, while the lips of a fool consume him. So let's break it down. Words from a wise man are described how? They're gracious. Is that a hard thing to contemplate? No. And he's talked about the ruler that, was in authority and got angry. And what did he say? Just take it. Be gracious. Don't respond back. Stay in control. But words from the fool do what? Consume him. What does consume mean? Well, sometimes we use the term that if something is consumed, that it's completely used up, right? It's all consumed, there's nothing left. But think about the specifics. We also use that word in terms of when the meal is finished, right? When we've eaten everything and we've had all there is to drink, right? Thanksgiving at your homes, lady, anybody had everything consumed, right? It was all used up or it was devoured. So those are two different words or definitions for that same word. But listen to this. Isn't that second description a play on the words for lips? Because the lips are what we use for the eating and the drinking, are what the fool uses to speak the words that consume the person. Interesting play on words that Solomon used there. Verse 13, the fool starts how? So the beginning of his talking is folly, right? And we've talked about the definition of that word. It's foolishness, it's dangerous, it can be all kinds of things. How does the fool end? The end of it is wickedness and madness. So the fool usually begins with a smaller evil, and when he gets by with that and is successful, he just keeps talking. He just keeps saying more and more, and it gets worse and worse. It doesn't get less and less. It's not like they had a little foolish moment and they learned their lesson. This fool continues down that path. Verse 14 says, what does the fool continue to do? Yet the fool multiplies his words, right? More and more words. So what indication does Solomon give about the foolish words? He says, no man knows what will happen, and who can tell him what will come after him. So let's make our little transition here. It would appear that the foolish words spoken from the fool indicated he knew what the future would be. Solomon emphatically concludes, no man can know what will happen. When a man speaks contrary to this, he's a fool. No man knows the future. It doesn't matter how many times you want to speak a word over whatever. You don't change God with your words. Only the foolish man speaks in such a way. We're going to tie that in to that story. We're not done with the story of Absalom. Okay? These verses will tie in as well. Verse 15 ends with what? It says, the toil of a fool wearies him so that he does not even know how to go to a city. In the end, the fool can't even keep up the pretense and resigns himself to his fate. This verse parallels a continuation of the story that we're following with Absalom's rebellion. And here's how we're going to connect it to a gentleman named, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to try really hard not to, Ahithophel. Anybody okay with that? Want to give me a better way? So Ahithophel. So we're going to follow. I did a word study, followed and read the whole story, but I didn't think you needed me to read all of 2 Kings to you. So I went back and I picked the verses that I think tie the story well enough together so you can follow this individual and what he did in that overall story. So we're going to start with 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 12. Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Giloth, while he was offering the sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So what do we know that Ahithophel is there? He's the counselor. What was he doing, though? In his city, what was he doing? While he was offering sacrifices. So we would get the impression, potentially, he is a priest. Wouldn't you say that would be the conclusion you might come to? So he's a counselor, and he's a priest, and he'd been a counselor before David. Absalom calls for him to be by his side. Why would Absalom do that? If I'm going to subvert somebody else's authority, don't I want the people there to come support me? Because now I can convince other people, look, that guy was his number one counselor. He's going to come follow me. So I must be in the right place, especially if it's a priest. This must be God ordained. And that's what Absalom's looking for. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 15, go down to verse 31. Now someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. Next chapter, chapter 16, verse 15. Then Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. So we see that introduction. He's right there by his side. He's coming in with Absalom into Jerusalem in this insurrection or rebellion. Verse 20, then Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your advice. What shall we do? So they've entered Jerusalem, right? And he turns to the counselor and he says, now what? I'm here. What should I do now that I'm here? Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left in the house. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself odious to your father. The hands of all who are with you will also be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof. And Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. How horrific was that advice and that act? The advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of the word of the Lord or the word of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel regarded by both David and Absalom. Why is that verse there? Is he underscoring something? Who does it look like that information came from? The word of God. God told me this is what you should do, Absalom. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 through 4 say, furthermore, Ahithophel said to Absalom, please let me choose 12,000 men that I may rise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him where he is weary and exhausted and terrify him so that all the people who are with him will flee. Then I will strike down the king alone, and I will bring back all the people to you. The return of everyone depends on the man you seek. Then all the people will be at peace." So the plan pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel. So does the fool keep speaking? Do his plans get worse and worse, more terrifying and wicked? I didn't read the whole story, but I'll just give you the little tidbit here in between. We're just going to tie them together. So Absalom, in this case, took the counsel from Hushai the Archite, which ultimately resulted in the death of Absalom and the return of David to Jerusalem. So if you want to do some study on your own, just dip right in there in 2 Samuel chapter 17, because this story just continues to unfold with drama and somebody talking to so-and-so and somebody else making plans, right? And all that went on in this rebellion. But here's how it ends in 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 23. Now, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and arose and went to his home, to his city, and set his house in order, and strangled himself. Thus he died and was buried in the grave of his father. This was a story of a fool whose words consumed him in the end. His advice for Absalom to go to David's concubines was folly, but the advice to track David, the anointed king, down immediately and to allow Ahithophel to kill him was wickedness and madness. Do you see the parallels back now in Ecclesiastes to a very story that Solomon would have been made aware of, would have been a witness to? So Ahithophel also spoke his words as if they were acquired from the word of the Lord. He acted as though he knew the future results of actions by claiming they were from God. That's very somber. Again, we've talked about Ecclesiastes. It's a great book. It teaches us great lessons, but it does it through very somber and quiet, reflective ways. It's not a party book. It's still a fabulous book because it's teaching us about the sovereignty of God, how it's always been the sovereignty of God. It is in our lives the sovereignty of God, and it will always be. Doesn't that bring more comfort than any party could ever bring? So back now to Ecclesiastes chapter 10, we'll do verses 16 through 20. Woe to you, O land, whose king is a lad and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, whose king is of nobility and whose princes eat at the appropriate time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through indolence the rafters sag, and through slackness the house leaks. Men prepare a meal for enjoyment, and wine makes life merry, and money is the answer to everything. Furthermore, in your bedchamber do not curse a king, and in your sleeping rooms do not curse a rich man. For a bird of the heavens will carry the sound, and the winged creature will make the matter known. Again, we have to go back to the story to make some tie-ins, and I think you'll be amazed. But let's talk about the first level. Didn't we talk about some of Solomon's teaching? Just on a surface level can be good advice. It'll make sense. But then when you tie it into the events that you know he's experienced, it takes a deeper meaning. So in verse 16, what warning does Solomon issue? It says, woe to you, O land. What is meant when something is referred to in the scripture as woe? What's up? It could be judgment. Even if you look up the general, dictionary.com definition of the word, it's an exclamation of grief, distress, or lamentation. It's not, whoa, yay, it's whoa, right? It's done with the lower voice, whoa. So what is O land referring to? In this case, when he says, woe, O land, it would be, well, it could be different things because it can be generic, right? It can be generic in multiple places. How would I describe that to somebody if I was trying to teach them about what this word means in this context? A land would be what? It would be a tribe or a country, right? We have countries and nations. It would be a group of people that are brought together under the rulership of someone, right? They didn't have all their little lines drawn on the map, right? They followed family tradition or family tribal authority figures. How is the king in this case described for these people? He is a lad. It can be physically, right? Because weren't some of the kings that came to the throne, even in Israel, very young when this occurs? But it could just mean the character of the person occupying that position, which would be merely a childish leader. And those that are in the positions of the princes do what in that verse? Feast in the morning. So what is the normal time of feasting? At night. When your work's all done, then you get the reward of feasting. So he's showing the fact these are not people that are in their positions who are feasting as they've earned it. They're taking their pleasure of feasting first. In verse 17, Solomon gives a comparison of what? Blessed are you, O land. Why is the land blessed? Whose king is of nobility. And what do these leaders do? They eat at the appropriate time. And for what reason? Strength, and not for drunkenness. So the purpose of the eating and the drinking is for doing the work they need to do. They do not participate in eating and drinking for the excessiveness of the experience. Do you see how it's a heart issue when you're talking about these leaders? It's a heart issue. The conclusion would be the leaders of the previous group did eat and drink excessively. In verse 18, what observation does Solomon make? Through indolence, the rafters sag, and through slackness, the house leaks. All right, what does indolent mean? Having or showing a disposition to avoid exertion. Slothful. Okay, so when one is lazy and is not attentive to the upkeep of a house in this case, the impact is seen. It's apparent. So in context, what Solomon just described are two lands with two different style leaders. Would you say? When leaders do not take care of a kingdom with diligence and hard work, but focus on self-indulgent behavior, the kingdom will suffer like the house left uncared for. Verse 19. What is the attitude displayed by these men? The men prepared a meal for their enjoyment, and the wine makes their life merry, and the money is the answer to everything. So the first thing mentioned was that they prepared their meal for enjoyment. What was just mentioned in verse 17 about the purpose of preparing a meal and what it should be for? For strength. The proper focus of leaders should do the things to be strong and not for self-indulgence. Even their daily activities, such as meal preparation, should be done with that higher focus in mind. When you've been elevated to a position of leadership, there are expectations that go with that authority. There's responsibility. That's what's lacking. They liked the authority and to be in charge, but they didn't like any of the responsibility that went with it. Have you experienced that in your lives, lady? Just look at history over and over and over. Solomon is talking about that here. The same is true with what is described next. He says, and when wine makes life merry. Remember, when we looked at the term merry as its description in the use of wine, it always carried the negative connotation in the excessive use. And if you want, you can go back to chapter 8, verse 15, where we talked about that specifically. The last example used of poor leadership is what? And money is the answer to everything. Well, I don't see what's wrong with that. Talking about politicians. So let's break that down a little bit without getting too political. How about that? Leaders who want to throw money at every situation are not good leaders. They are lazy leaders. Again, ladies, I'm not getting political, so I don't want anybody to go there, okay? Good leaders make sacrifices of themselves by finding real solution to problems. Ultimately, they open the door for corruption if all they do is acquire more money and think that money solves the problem. Again, a little short history in probably any government in any time in history, and you will find this to be true, including ours. So that's why I say I'm not being political. I'm saying this is what happens in governments when men think money solves all their problems. As a matter of fact, wouldn't it be nice if they'd sharpen their axes instead? Right? Have a little wisdom. Verse 20. What warning does Solomon present next? All right, now we're into the bedchambers and not cursing the king and the sleeping rooms. Okay, here we go. Solomon warned against a word spoken against the rulers. Could we agree that that at least is what we're looking at there? Back in verses 12 through 15, we dealt with the impact of words that were spoken by fools versus the words that were spoken by wise men. Now here in verse 20, Solomon gives a specific example of words which could be spoken by fools. So let's break it down. What would it mean to curse a king while in your bedchamber? So here's where we're going to go with the definition. What is a bedchamber? We don't have those, so it's hard for us to relate to the culture. This can also be referred to as the lord of the bedchamber. It's just a little Wikipedia background for you. The duties of this person who was in the bedchamber, or the lord of the bedchamber, their duties originally consisted of assisting the monarch with dressing, waiting on him when he ate, guarding access to his bedchamber and closet, and providing companionship. Such functions became less important over time, but provided proximity to the monarch, and the holders were thus trusted confidants and extremely powerful. The offices were in the gift of the crown and were originally sworn by royal warrant directed to the lord of the chamber. If you read on, there was some things in Wikipedia. This word wasn't really commonly used until 1728. And I was thinking, I guess they didn't read Ecclesiastes. Here it is, right here. This position then was to be held by someone in service to the king. And when one held that position, it would be extremely foolish to curse the king. You agree? Verse 20, what else should one avoid doing? And in your sleeping rooms, do not curse a rich man. All right, the sleeping rooms would be lesser rooms than the official bedchamber. Right? The official bedchamber is the king's guy, but they would be used for those in attendance of the king's business. All of these rooms were often within the royal house. The best example I can give you is from a trip that I took to the Palace of Versailles, and we got a history lesson. So we left Paris and we went to Versailles on a train. So it's a distance that you have to travel, all right? In France, I love this story. In France, the king, when he went on vacation to the villa out in Versailles, made everybody else in his court take vacation with him. They all had to leave Paris and go to Versailles. That's why it's massive and had rooms everywhere. All those men of power needed to go with him. Why would he take all the men of power with him? What could those men do while the king's away on vacation? Right? They could take power. They could plan evil things when the king's not around to keep an eye on them. So they all had to go. And the story goes, at least the little gal that did our tour explained, when the king got up in the morning, and we were standing in the room that was considered the room of the king. I mean, it's massive. It's not as big as this room, but it was huge. And then there's a little bed with the curtain, because that's the only thing that gave me any kind of privacy. And then the doors were on either end of the room, so you had people walk through. There wasn't a separate hallway. So they would open those doors, and that's how somebody would walk through. Plus, there was doorways on either side of the bed, and there were hidden hallways that direction. So that's how the servants would come and go into the king's room and not have to run through all the halls. When the king got up in the morning, everybody who was anybody had to be there in the morning when the king woke up. They had to show that they were there. They hadn't left town. They hadn't gone somewhere overnight and disappeared. So you were kind of a prisoner to the king. You got to go to your little bedchamber and you could sleep there, but in the morning you better be up bright and early and ready to hear what the king's business was for you or anybody else that day. That's how they kept power and control. Now picture that when you're talking about the world of royalty in Israel. Does that make more sense now as we unfold this picture of the bedchambers? All right. So these rooms would be where the officials of the court would stay. These would be the rich men that we talked about, verse 20 here, and maybe the wise and rich that were referred to earlier. Solomon is saying these men should not be cursing not only the king, but each other. Not tearing down the leaders of the kingdom. Verse 20 said, what will happen when these men speak against the king or each other? What was the conclusion in verse 20? A bird of the heavens will carry the sound, and the winged creature will make the matter known. A little birdie told me that's exactly where we get that. So there will be a bird that will carry the sound. What is the sound that the bird will carry? The curse spoken against the king and the men of the court. What did the bird do with the sound? Make the matter known. Wouldn't it be interesting if the story that we were following with Absalom had a bird? Or at least something like a bird? This deception will be made known and it will not be secret. This was demonstrated in the time of Absalom's rebellion. 2 Samuel chapter 15. I'm going to read verses 31 through 37. Starting in 15:31. Now someone told David. Isn't that interesting? We don't even get a name for that one. Someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of him foolishness. It happened as David was coming to the summit where God was worshipped, that behold, Hushai the Archite met him with his coat torn and dust on his head. Now, just to give you a little context before I read on, David is left and is in the wilderness, right? Ahithophel and Absalom are back in Jerusalem. There are men who are wanting to join David and show their support for David. So they're coming to this place, and then David would say whether they could join him. So cross over and join us. You can be part of us. So this man comes up. He's demonstrating his mourning or sadness by his clothes being torn and the ashes on his head. He's sad about the event that has happened, and he wants to join David's cause. But David says, no. In verse 33, David said to him, if you pass over with me, then you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so I will now be your servant. Then you can thwart the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And are not Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there? So it shall be, whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall report to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, their 2 sons are with them there, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send me everything you hear." So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came in to Jerusalem. What an amazing story of setting up a spy network. Isn't that exactly what David just did? He set up his spy network. So he sees this guy that he knows he can trust, and he's like, you come over here, I don't see much use for you. I just got to feed you and everything else. But I best could use you. Once you go back to Jerusalem, and you can say whatever you need to Absalom to convince him. I mean, others have. I've got others that are back there that have changed sides, so you wouldn't be the only one. And by the way, while you're there, you're going to hear things. And where did the hearing things come from? Whatever you hear from the king's house. Who do you think was chit-chatting about what they heard in the king's house? Those who were staying around the bedchambers, potentially. That's what Solomon tells us back here in Ecclesiastes. Isn't that an interesting detail? In chapter 17, verse 17 of 2 Samuel, now Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying in Rogal, and a maid servant would go and tell them, and they would go and tell King David, for they could not be seen entering the city. The maid servant transferred the information. This is quite the spy network. So Solomon's making a reference here in verse 20 back to the little birdie. Be careful when you're in the bedchamber and do not curse the king. And by the way, when you're staying in the bedrooms, you probably shouldn't be talking bad about the king or anybody else in power, because the walls have ears and the birdies will tell on you. And the birdies did tell on them. It's all there. Is that just not, this one blew my mind, ladies. I was like, there's a spy network and the people were talking, and it says, I don't know who. Now someone told David one thing, and now you got the maidservant. It's just this interesting story if you go back and you read it, and the intrigue of how this happened, and the information went to the priests, and then the priests told their sons, and then their sons went to a different city. They had to be careful not to be seen entering the city because they knew they were being watched by people. So then they would meet with the maidservant. And if you read the story, you'll find out somebody did see them, a young lad, and he went and ran and he told Absalom. And so then Absalom sent his men to find these two sons of the priest to try to kill them. And then they were hidden in a well by a woman. Hollywood's missing such an opportunity for fabulous stories. What's that?
That's what I was thinking.
Yep, they hid in the well, and it's just, as I'm reading the story, I told Stephen, I feel like I should have everybody on stage, and you'll be Absalom, and you'll be the two priests, and you'll be the sons, and I'll have you walk around the stage because it's so confusing to follow the story. But Solomon gives us this amazing picture. Way back in Ecclesiastes, he knows exactly what happened. Again, ladies, if you read the commentaries, whatever, they talk about the surface level. Is it true you probably shouldn't be speaking bad about your leaders? Well, of course it is. But Solomon takes it to that next level. He ties it back to a story that he lived through. He knew what the results of the little talking birdie had been. And he's revealing what evil goes with the men who speak foolishly. And he's got a specific man in mind, even though he didn't use his name. So could it be that in Ecclesiastes 10:20 that we are speaking of the same event and how David was able to learn what plans were made against him?